I'm Haley Taylor, and you're listening to the Rough Draft Diaries. That may be a familiar sound if you're a frequent visitor of the Toledo Zoo, and that's exactly where we're going on this episode of the Rough Draft Diaries. We'll be meeting with Kent Bekker. He's the Director of Conservation Research.
So I've been at the Toledo Zoo since '97, and I was hired here as a herpetology keeper and worked in the reptile and amphibian department, which is the study of reptiles and amphibians is herpetology, for about 15 years probably.
Kent's background in herpetology essentially led him to his current position as the Director of Conservation. After working as a herpetology keeper, he joined the local conservation effort, Wild Toledo.
And so I started doing that initially, and it was a great way for the zoo to further the mission. I think when people think about zoo conservation, they often think about exotic species, and the reality is a lot of the issues facing exotic wildlife are facing our local wildlife. Things going on in people's backyards is a really great way for the zoo to reach its mission, because people generally care more about that than they do things in faraway lands. So after doing the Wild Toledo program for about 3 years, then our previous Director of Conservation retired, and I replaced him in the Director position.
Now, the Director of Conservation does look over both the national conservation projects and the local ones. But since we don't have a great deal of time, we'll just focus on the local efforts. And the perfect place to start would be butterflies.
So a good example of a program that is focused on endangered species locally that we've had a long history of doing, it predates my involvement with the Conservation Department, was the Karner blue butterfly, which is a federally endangered butterfly, along with Mitchell Sater's butterfly, another federally endangered butterfly. In both of those circumstances, we collect wild individuals under permit, and then we rear them here at the zoo and then release them to new locations to establish new populations. And it segues really into some of the other conservation work we're doing, like our urban prairie initiative. We have 40 acres now that the Toledo Zoo staff are managing of partner properties, and what we're doing through that is creating habitat, which is benefiting ecological system function, handling of rainwater, along with creating habitat for pollinators and things like the monarch, which again is a perfect segue into some of these more endangered species programs that we do locally and nationally.
Some of the other endangered local species include the Blandings turtle, the Kirtland snake, monarch butterflies, native bees, native birds, and many others. But the one thing they hold in common is the reason that they are endangered, and that is the threat of their local habitat.
So in the case of the federally endangered butterfly species I mentioned, their issue is predominantly loss of habitat. So they have a very specialized habitat. In the case of the Mitchell Saters, it's a fen, and a lot of fens are lost through a succession, just fens becoming, closed canopy situations, and often they get managed back to a fen. So there is sometimes habitat that had historically been lost. But usually it's a habitat issue for the endangered species. But in the case of monarchs, we also have a habitat issue where there's just loss of the host plant, which in the case of the monarch is the milkweed. And although it's occurring at a different scale, we've converted a lot of land from what was historically edge of agriculture or natural areas to human use areas. And when we really drill down to it, a lot of it can be explained by loss of habitat and landscape changes to the habitat.
If you think about it, there has been a lot of landscape changes to the city of Toledo. So it would be easy to blame that habitat loss on those businesses that have been acquiring land or the families who have changed that agricultural field into a suburb. But Kent believes those accusations are too easy to make and that the issue goes much deeper than that. The real problem is a growing disconnect between humans and their relationship with the land.
There certainly is, in general. I think that whether we're talking about zoos or whether we're talking about metropolitan park districts or just humans in general, I think we've reached a point where there is an extreme disconnect from what children are doing with their day. I mean, I started this mentioning the fact that I went down to the local creek and explored the crayfish and caught snakes. I don't think you find children these days that do that for an appreciable amount of their time. I think part of that is just the way we're losing the landscape. Maybe there aren't as many opportunities, but I think that is a lot of that is a social change in the way that we view nature and maybe what we value children doing. But no, I think there definitely is a shift away from, in very recent times, in people's connection with nature.
And that's why Kent believes so deeply in his job. He feels he's working to reconnect people with the nature and their backyards.
I think what's really interesting about what we do here is when it is backyard species or species that people don't really even know are in their backyard, it's an amazing way to educate people and get people to care a little bit more. We have a staff member, Dr. Ryan Walsh, who has done a lot with orchids. A lot of people don't even realize that we have local orchids here. We have many, several local orchid species, and as soon as we start talking to people about it, I think they now have an appreciation and interest that they didn't historically. Certainly the reptiles that we work with, Kirtland snakes and Blaney's turtles, fall in that category. Most people don't even have any idea that we have a wet meadow marsh specialist turtle that we periodically see and probably spends a lot of its life down in crayfish burrows. And so once we start to talk to people about that, it's pretty easy to explain to them why those species are critical and why those habitats are critical and why they should care. And in general, I think that the education is of great benefit from that perspective.
For now, I'm Haley Taylor, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Rough Draft Diaries. Kent's choices for the next episode of the Rough Draft Diaries include
Alex Getz, Tim Sheeter from the Toledo Area Metro Parks, and Scott Butterworth from Ohio Division of Wildlife.
You'll have to tune in next time to find out who I pick on the Rough Draft Diaries.